In the declining days of the Third Empire, deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, a woman who had once been the face of Nazi domestic virtue calmly administered poison to her 6 young children. She did it not in a frenzy, but with a quiet, deliberate conviction shaped by years of ideological devotion and personal ambition. That woman was Magda Goebbels, wife of Joseph Goebbels, confidant of Adolf Hitler, and self-appointed guardian of the Nazi future. Her name is now etched into history not merely as a figure of maternal tragedy, but as a chilling embodiment of how ordinary desires for love, prestige, and belonging can fuse with dangerous ideas to produce extraordinary horror. Understanding her is not simply about revisiting a grotesque chapter of history, but about confronting the seductive power of belief when it wears a human face. Magda Goebbels remains one of the most haunting and enigmatic figures of the Nazi era. Her name is often overshadowed by the male titans of the Third Empire: Hitler, Himmler, Göring, and of course her husband, Joseph Goebbels. But her role, while less formally political, was far from passive. In fact, her prominence as a public figure within the Nazi regime earned her the unofficial moniker First Lady of the Third Empire, a title that reflected not only her symbolic importance in Hitler's inner circle, but her representation of the ideal Aryan woman: elegant, devoted, maternal, and ideologically loyal. Yet her legacy is one of moral contradiction and psychological complexity. A woman of intelligence, culture, and social ambition who ultimately became a willing participant in one of the most horrific regimes in modern history. Born into a turbulent family situation, Magda's early life was marked by disruption, international exposure, and eventual entry into the elite circles of Weimar Germany. From an early age, she exhibited a natural grace and charm, coupled with intellectual curiosity and a strong sense of social positioning. These traits helped her ascend from a privileged but uncertain girlhood into the opulent world of Germany's industrial class, through her first marriage to the wealthy magnate Günther Quandt. Her transition into Nazi politics through her second marriage to Joseph Goebbels was not merely a romantic or circumstantial evolution. It was a calculated, if not fully understood, alignment with a movement that promised national rebirth and personal transcendence. What makes Magda Goebbels such a paradoxical and compelling subject is not merely that she was married to the Minister of Propaganda, nor that she bore 6 children into the very heart of Nazi mythology. It is the fact that she did so while maintaining a public persona of refinement, devotion, and even motherly tenderness, which directly conflicted with the atrocities being committed around her. She was seen smiling at public events, standing near Hitler at official functions, and promoting the idealized image of a Nazi family, all while the regime pursued a path of genocide, repression, and total war. Her composure and grace masked a profound ideological commitment that would lead her to orchestrate the deaths of her own children in Hitler's bunker, rather than allow them to live in a world without National Socialism. To understand Magda Goebbels is to grapple with uncomfortable truths about complicity, agency, and the seductive power of ideology. She was not simply a puppet of her husband's ambitions, nor merely a victim of the time. She was an active agent, politically informed, emotionally invested, and ideologically steadfast. Her story challenges simplistic narratives about gender roles and fascist regimes. She was neither the oppressed housewife nor the naive follower, but a woman who found purpose, identity, and perhaps a perverse sense of salvation in aligning herself with Nazism. The designation First Lady of the Third Empire is worth unpacking, as it reveals much about her function and visibility within the regime. The Third Empire had no official First Lady in the way that democratic governments do. Adolf Hitler remained famously unmarried until the final day of his life, and thus there was no formal spouse to assume such a role. Eva Braun, though romantically linked to Hitler for over a decade, was largely kept in the shadows, her existence more personal than political. Magda, by contrast, occupied a public position. As the wife of the Empire Minister of Propaganda and one of the most photogenic and socially poised women in the Nazi elite, she became a de facto figurehead. Her appearances at state functions, in party rallies, and on the arms of high-ranking officials allowed her to personify the Nazi ideal of womanhood. In Nazi propaganda, she embodied order, domestic virtue, racial purity, and ideological loyalty, traits the regime sought to project as fundamental to its vision for the future of Germany. The aim of this video is to explore the full arc of Magda Goebbels' life, not merely her public appearances or infamous death, but the personal motivations, ideological convictions, and social forces that shaped her journey from a bourgeois upbringing to the heart of Hitler's court. By examining her as both a product and a participant of her time, we hope to avoid the reductionism that often characterizes female figures in fascist histories. Was she a true believer, or a woman intoxicated by power and proximity to influence? Did she see herself as a mother of a nation, or as a martyr for a lost cause? Was her final act in the Berlin bunker an act of political fanaticism, personal despair, or moral cowardice? These are the questions that demand serious consideration. This inquiry is not meant to elicit sympathy, but to provide understanding of how someone with apparent intelligence, emotional depth, and social mobility could come to embrace a regime built on cruelty, suppression, and genocide. The lessons drawn from her story are not confined to the past. In exploring how Magda Goebbels aligned herself with Nazi ideology, we confront larger questions about human psychology. What drives individuals, especially women with access to power, education, and privilege, to willingly join violent movements? How do private ambitions and ideological narratives reinforce each other? And how do ordinary people become historical agents of extraordinary evil? A combination of archival records, including Nazi Party documents, personal correspondence, and contemporary newspaper articles, provides a factual backbone for the chronology of events. Magda's own letters and diary entries, though scarce, offer a glimpse into her interior world, helping to frame her actions within her own emotional and psychological landscape. Memoirs of contemporaries, especially those who interacted with her in the bunker or within Hitler's inner circle, also provide crucial insight, albeit with careful attention to the biases and self-preserving narratives they often contain. Additionally, post-war testimonies, especially from figures like Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, and Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, are instrumental in reconstructing her final days. Where direct sources are limited, careful interpretation and cross-referencing with broader patterns in Nazi propaganda and ideology are used to construct a fuller picture. Secondary sources from historians, psychoanalysts, and feminist theorists provide a framework for understanding the deeper cultural and ideological implications of her life and actions. In bringing together these strands, this video does not aim to exonerate Magda Goebbels, nor to sensationalize her story. Rather, it seeks to approach her life with the complexity it deserves, in order to understand the conditions, personal, political, and ideological, that allowed a woman of grace and intelligence to become a committed supporter of one of the most brutal regimes in human history. Her life, and especially her death, stands as a stark reminder that evil does not always come in monstrous forms. Sometimes, it comes dressed in elegance, speaking softly, smiling politely, and believing utterly in the righteousness of its cause. By exploring the biography of Magda Goebbels with both factual rigor and moral clarity, we aim to better understand how personal identity becomes entangled with collective delusion, and how individuals, even those in seemingly minor or symbolic roles, can become instrumental in the machinery of historical catastrophe. In this story lies not only the tragedy of a woman and her children, but a cautionary tale for any age tempted by authoritarian seduction and ideological purity. Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl, later known to history as Magda Goebbels, was born on November 11, 1901, in Berlin, at the very dawn of a century that would see her rise to become one of its most infamous and enigmatic figures. Her life would later be defined by politics, propaganda, and tragedy, but her early years were shaped primarily by instability, social striving, and a complex family dynamic that laid the groundwork for her future decisions. Understanding Magda's origins is essential to understanding the woman she became, a devoted follower of Hitler, the wife of the Nazi regime's chief propagandist, and the woman who would kill her 6 children in the final act of allegiance to a collapsing empire. Magda was born into a world of bourgeois comfort, though not of extraordinary privilege. Her father, Oskar Ritschl, was a mechanical engineer, a profession that carried social respect but not great wealth. Her mother, Auguste Behrend, came from a similar middle-class background. Their marriage, however, was troubled. When Magda was only about 5 years old, her parents divorced, a relatively rare and stigmatized occurrence in early 20th century Germany. The split left a lasting impression on her. While divorce today might not be as socially disruptive, at that time it fractured Magda's early sense of stability and contributed to a lifelong preoccupation with security, both emotional and material. Her father soon faded from the picture, and her mother, now a single parent, moved on quickly. Auguste married Richard Friedlander, a successful Jewish businessman, and the man Magda would come to regard as her true father figure during her formative years. This relationship proved deeply influential. Friedlander adopted Magda, and she took his surname for a time. He was kind, cultured, and provided for the family, exposing Magda to a lifestyle of moderate refinement and, perhaps more importantly, to cosmopolitan and multicultural ideas. Her later rejection of this background, especially as a committed Nazi and the wife of Joseph Goebbels, is one of the greatest ironies of her life. While Friedlander cared for her and supported her education, he would later become one of the millions of Jewish victims of the regime Magda so fervently supported. He was arrested during the Holocaust and died in Buchenwald concentration camp, a fact that casts a dark shadow over Magda's biography and raises profound questions about her moral choices and psychological compartmentalization. Magda's education further shaped her early identity. She attended a Catholic school in the town of Valverde in Belgium, an institution that combined strict discipline with an international outlook. While her mother was not especially religious, the Catholic instruction provided a sense of order and tradition that Magda seemed to appreciate. From an early age, she exhibited poise, charm, and a keen sensitivity to how she was perceived by others. These qualities became central to her personality. Teachers and acquaintances noted her intelligence and self-possession, though she was not considered especially academically gifted. What she excelled at was navigating social environments, adapting, appealing, and positioning herself to rise. After her years in Belgium, Magda attended a finishing school in Switzerland, a typical step for young women of her social class. These institutions emphasized etiquette, language, and culture rather than academic rigor, preparing girls not for careers but for advantageous marriages. For Magda, this education reinforced her appreciation for elegance and cultivated behavior, but it also deepened her understanding of social hierarchies and the importance of image. She learned French and English, studied piano, and gained exposure to European culture and fashion, all of which made her stand out in Germany's post-war chaos after World War I. Her teenage and early adult years coincided with the disintegration of the German Empire, the trauma of World War I, and the upheaval of the Weimar Republic. Like many Germans of her generation, Magda came of age during national humiliation and economic collapse. She witnessed firsthand the way social structures could dissolve, fortunes could vanish, and respectability could be lost. These experiences sharpened her instincts for survival and increased her attraction to order, status, and power. Amid the volatility of the 1920s, she sought out stability not through work or ideology, but through social ascent. She internalized the belief that security and identity were best achieved through alignment with power. Even as a young woman, Magda showed a fascination with figures of authority and influence. Her first notable romantic relationship was with a Zionist named Chaim Arlasarov, a bright, ambitious Jewish student who would later become a leader in the Jewish Agency in British Palestine. The relationship, which lasted around a year, has been the subject of much speculation. Some historians view it as evidence of her early openness and cosmopolitanism, while others see it as a youthful flirtation without deep ideological implications. Arlasarov was passionate and politically active, and the pair reportedly shared intellectual and emotional intimacy. Yet their worlds were too far apart. Magda, with her eye on social status and conventional marriage, ultimately ended the relationship. Her later transformation into a Nazi leader's wife, especially one so close to the regime's anti-Semitic heart, renders the relationship all the more striking. In later years, her defenders sometimes pointed to Arlasarov as proof that she was not innately racist or ideologically rigid in youth, though others counter that her later actions render such arguments irrelevant. By the time Magda was in her early 20s, she had developed a distinct persona, a beautiful, self-assured, and socially adept young woman, poised for entry into Germany's upper classes. She combined conventional femininity with ambition, projecting charm and elegance while also pursuing opportunities for social mobility. This combination made her attractive to men of power and influence, an advantage she would leverage throughout her life. She was not, at this point, politically radical. There is no evidence that she held strong ideological beliefs in her early adulthood. Rather, her motivations seemed to center on finding a place in a world where personal advancement, not political conviction, was her guiding star. Her marriage in 1921 to industrialist Günther Quandt, one of the wealthiest men in Germany, confirmed her ability to navigate and ascend the social ladder. It marked the end of her formative years and the beginning of her transformation into a public figure. But that story belongs to the next chapter. What is clear from her upbringing is that Magda Goebbels was shaped by a blend of privilege and insecurity, cosmopolitan exposure and nationalist longing, personal ambition and emotional need. She was not born into fanaticism or destined for infamy. Her early life offered numerous paths, some liberal, some conservative, some merely bourgeois. That she chose the darkest one available is what makes her story not only tragic but deeply disturbing. Magda's early years also reveal an unsettling ability to compartmentalize. The affection she felt for her Jewish stepfather, and her romantic connection with a Jewish youth leader, did not prevent her from later embracing Nazi ideology or ignoring the fate of those close to her. This psychological flexibility or moral pliability became one of the defining traits of her adult life. Whether this was rooted in narcissism, survivalism, or sincere ideological evolution remains debated, but it points to a personality capable of profound disconnection between personal sentiment and political allegiance. The themes of abandonment, identity, and social ambition ran like threads through her early life. Her father's departure, her complex relationship with Friedlander, and her immersion in social hierarchies all contributed to a deep longing for belonging and significance. In the fragmented post-war world of Weimar Germany, these needs could easily lead to extreme answers. Magda found hers in the Nazi Party not out of desperation, but out of a calculated desire for structure, power, and meaning. And so, from the shattered pieces of a respectable but fractured childhood, she would go on to craft one of the most polished yet terrifying personas in Nazi Germany, the serene and smiling First Lady of a regime built on death. In examining Magda's early life, it becomes clear that her later choices were not made in a vacuum. Her trajectory was shaped by both internal desires and external circumstances, by psychological wounds and cultural pressures. She was the product of her time, but she was also an active shaper of her destiny. The seeds of her future were planted not just in the ideology she would later adopt, but in the values, ambitions, and contradictions she absorbed as a girl growing up in a world veering toward collapse. Her early life doesn't excuse her later crimes, but it helps explain how a young girl from Berlin came to believe that the destruction of her own children was preferable to their survival in a world without Nazism. Magda's marriage to Günther Quandt marked a pivotal transition in her life from a young woman of moderate means and uncertain direction to the wife of one of the wealthiest men in Germany. This chapter in her life was not just about personal relationships. It was also a deeply strategic move that solidified her entry into Germany's industrial aristocracy and laid the groundwork for the ambitions she would later pursue in the political sphere. The story of her marriage to Quandt reveals much about her motivations, the world she inhabited, and the ways in which status, privilege, and power shaped her worldview long before she ever met Joseph Goebbels or pledged allegiance to Adolf Hitler. Günther Quandt was already an established figure when he met Magda in the early 1920s. A widower and industrial magnate, he had amassed a fortune in textiles, batteries, and manufacturing, with extensive business interests that would soon make the Quandt name synonymous with industrial might in Germany. He was nearly 20 years her senior, emotionally reserved, and already a father. Magda, still in her early 20s, was strikingly beautiful, poised, and socially ambitious. Their relationship, while not founded on romantic passion in the traditional sense, offered each something valuable. For Magda, it was a chance at upward mobility, financial security, and entry into a world of privilege. For Quandt, she offered beauty, social grace, and the promise of a renewed domestic life following the death of his first wife. They married in January 1921, and not long afterward, Magda gave birth to their only child, Harold Quandt, in November of that same year. The birth of her son gave Magda a new role and a stronger foothold in the elite circles she now moved within. She embraced the duties of motherhood, at least outwardly, and quickly adapted to the refined life that came with being Frau Quandt. Their lifestyle was one of opulence, estates, servants, luxury travel, and all the markers of high society in the Weimar Republic. The couple moved between Berlin luxury resorts and the Quandt family estate in the countryside, and Magda made every effort to fit the mold of an ideal upper-class wife. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the marriage was far from harmonious. Quandt was a private, methodical man with little interest in emotional intimacy. He was more businessman than companion, more patriarch than partner. Magda, still young and restless, found herself increasingly isolated and unfulfilled. Though she enjoyed the privileges of wealth, she felt stifled in the marriage. Her role was decorative and functional, but not intellectually or emotionally stimulating. Moreover, the large age gap and differences in temperament strained their relationship further. What had initially been a promising arrangement soon began to unravel. The tensions eventually led to their separation and then to divorce in 1929, after 8 years of marriage. By this time, Magda had grown increasingly disillusioned with the life she had once sought. Despite the material comfort, she felt trapped, and the divorce offered her an escape, though not without cost. In the social climate of Weimar Germany, a divorced woman, even one with a child, risked losing status. However, Magda was no ordinary divorcee. She had been the wife of one of Germany's wealthiest men and the mother of his child. Importantly, she retained not only the social connections forged during her marriage but also a measure of financial independence due to the generous support Quandt continued to provide. Her introduction to National Socialism was not merely ideological but intensely personal. It came through her encounter with Joseph Goebbels, the man who would become her second husband and one of the central architects of Nazi propaganda. Their meeting occurred in 1930, at a time when Goebbels was already gaining notoriety as a skilled orator and publicist for the movement. He was intense, magnetic, and driven by a messianic sense of purpose. Magda, still in her 20s but with the poise of someone older, was immediately intrigued. She was not drawn to him for his appearance. Goebbels was short, with a clubfoot and an almost rodent-like face, but for his passion, his energy, and his absolute certainty. Goebbels, in turn, was captivated by Magda's beauty and social refinement. She offered him a kind of legitimacy he still lacked. A cultured and elegant woman with connections to the upper classes and a background that would polish his own proletarian image. Their attraction was thus rooted in more than romantic chemistry. Each saw in the other a complement to their ambitions. She could elevate his image and he could offer her a path to the inner circle of a movement on the rise. Their early letters and interactions reflect not only affection but mutual admiration for what each represented. For Magda, Goebbels personified the urgency and dynamism that her life had lacked with Quandt. For Goebbels, Magda was proof that the Nazi movement could seduce even the refined and educated, an important symbolic victory in itself. As Magda grew closer to Goebbels, her relationship with the Nazi Party deepened. She began attending party meetings, reading its literature, and, most importantly, spending time around Adolf Hitler himself. From the beginning, she appears to have been impressed not only by Hitler's aura but also by his attentiveness to her. Unlike many male politicians of the time, Hitler had an instinctive understanding of how to use women to serve political purposes. He recognized Magda's potential immediately. She was tall, graceful, classically beautiful, and impeccably poised, a near-perfect embodiment of the Nazi ideal of Aryan femininity. But beyond her looks, she possessed a sharp emotional intelligence and an ability to read a room, qualities that allowed her to navigate the treacherous landscape of Nazi politics with more skill than many men. Hitler took a personal liking to Magda, calling her the ideal German woman, and welcoming her into his inner circle with unusual warmth. She, in turn, became deeply devoted to him, almost reverently so. Her devotion to Hitler has long been debated. Was it rooted in genuine ideological conviction, or was it an extension of her ambition, her need to align herself with the most powerful man in the room? The truth likely lies in the murky middle. Magda was not an intellectual ideologue in the strict sense. She did not write political treatises or lead rallies. But she internalized the Nazi worldview with frightening ease. She came to see the party as not just a vehicle for national redemption, but as a sacred cause. Her loyalty to Hitler was real, even if it was initially nurtured through admiration and opportunism rather than philosophical exploration. Magda's conversion to Nazism cannot be cleanly separated from her personal ambitions. She had always sought structure and meaning in male figures, first her stepfather, then Quandt, then Goebbels, and finally Hitler. Each represented a progression toward greater intensity, both emotionally and ideologically. As Goebbels rose through the ranks to become Empire Minister of Propaganda, Magda rose alongside him, often appearing by his side at official events and cultivating an image of serene domesticity that was, in fact, carefully stage-managed. She took on the role of the Nazi regime's ideal woman not through active political engagement, but through presence, appearance, and symbolism. She dressed modestly but with elegance, she bore children, 6 with Goebbels, and she maintained an image of calm, maternal devotion even as the regime committed atrocities across Europe. Her public image was not that of a virago or a political agitator, but of a model wife and mother, an embodiment of the traditional values the Nazis claimed to champion. Yet behind this facade was a woman who was anything but passive. Magda worked to maintain her influence, not just over her husband, who was prone to extramarital affairs and political scheming, but also within the wider Nazi elite. She corresponded directly with Hitler, offered counsel to her husband, and cultivated relationships with other high-ranking figures in the regime. The Nazi regime, ever attuned to the power of image and symbolism, saw in Magda a propaganda tool of immense value. She was often photographed with her children, smiling serenely as if to suggest that the Third Empire was not only militarily strong but morally sound, grounded in wholesome family life. These images were widely disseminated and carefully curated. The reality, of course, was more complex. The Goebbels marriage was strained by Joseph's infidelities and Magda's own disillusionment. Yet the regime demanded a different image and she played her role with conviction, masking the dysfunction with grace. Her children, blonde and photogenic, were also folded into this image, becoming symbols of the ideal Nazi family. Her relationship with Hitler was critical to maintaining this public persona. He saw her not just as a loyal supporter but as a kind of spiritual sister, someone who understood the mission and was willing to sacrifice everything for it. Indeed, Hitler often visited the Goebbels household, and it was during these visits that Magda solidified her position as the regime's de facto first lady. Hitler, unmarried and aloof in public, preferred to keep his relationship with Eva Braun private. Magda, then, was the woman most associated with his personal life in the public imagination, a role she cherished and guarded fiercely. She referred to Hitler with reverence and, by all accounts, adored him with a fervor that bordered on the religious. The line between personal belief and political calculation in Magda's life is difficult to draw. Her admiration for Hitler, her dedication to the Nazi cause, and her embrace of the role assigned to her were all real. But they were also inseparable from her understanding that power in the Third Empire flowed through proximity to Hitler. By placing herself close to him, emotionally and symbolically, Magda ensured her survival and prominence within a regime that could be as ruthless to insiders as to its enemies. Over time, this ideological commitment hardened. What may have begun as a blend of ambition and social conformity became genuine fanaticism. Magda came to believe that the Nazi regime was not merely a political solution but a moral one, that it represented the salvation of Germany, and that to live in a world without it was not only unacceptable but unthinkable. This belief would lead her to the most terrible decision of her life, one that would horrify even hardened Nazis: the murder of her 6 children in Hitler's bunker as the regime collapsed around her. But the seeds of that decision were planted here, in her early embrace of a movement that demanded not just loyalty but total sacrifice. In her journey from bourgeois divorcee to national icon of Aryan womanhood, Magda Goebbels illustrates how ideology, ambition, and personal identity can become fatally entangled. Her life in the early 1930s, particularly her relationship with Goebbels and Hitler, represents not a break from her past but a continuation of it. She had always sought significance, and in National Socialism she believed she had found a cause worthy of her devotion. Whether one sees her as a cynic, a believer, or a tragic dupe, one thing is clear: by the time she fully embraced Nazism, there was no turning back. She had fused her identity with the regime so completely that its fall would necessitate her own destruction. In 1931, Magda's marriage to Joseph Goebbels marked not only a personal union but also a symbolic consolidation of political image-making and private ambition within the Nazi hierarchy. The wedding was more than a celebration of love or even political partnership; it was a carefully orchestrated event with national significance. Adolf Hitler himself acted as a witness at their civil ceremony, underscoring the deep personal and ideological bond between Magda, Goebbels, and the Führer. This single act elevated the ceremony far beyond the private realm. In the eyes of the Nazi elite and the public, it was a powerful message of unity, strength, and the new social order that National Socialism intended to bring about. Hitler's presence at their wedding was especially important for Magda. Not only did it signify her growing intimacy with him, but it also cemented her status as a leading woman within the Nazi regime. By aligning herself closely with Hitler emotionally, symbolically, and socially, she solidified her own authority within the political structure of the Third Empire. At this moment, Magda transitioned fully from a socially ambitious woman to a political figure who would represent the values and aspirations of the Nazi state in the most intimate and visible way possible, through the performance of idealized family life, public loyalty, and femininity. As Joseph Goebbels rose swiftly through the ranks to become Empire Minister of Propaganda, Magda's position also rose, not through direct political activity but through social and symbolic means. She embraced her role as the wife of one of the most powerful men in the empire, mastering the expectations placed upon her. In public, she was always graceful, composed, and attentive, projecting the image of serene domestic stability that contrasted sharply with the violent radicalism of the regime her husband helped promote. Behind closed doors, the Goebbels household became a hub of Nazi high society. Their Berlin residence and country estate in Schwanenwerder were frequently used for entertaining diplomats, officials, foreign guests, and Nazi functionaries. Magda was the perfect hostess, multilingual, charming, and sophisticated. She helped create an atmosphere that was both elegant and ideologically charged, a blend of personal warmth and political intimidation. Magda's dual identity, both public and private, required constant performance. She had to appear both deeply loyal to her husband and perfectly aligned with the Nazi vision of German womanhood. This meant she could not be merely decorative. She had to actively embody the ideals of racial purity, self-sacrifice, order, and maternal strength. Her beauty, composure, and upper-class bearing made her an ideal symbol for the regime's female archetype. She did not merely live as Goebbels' wife. She functioned as a visual and cultural affirmation of National Socialism itself. Her presence at rallies, parades, and cultural events was never incidental. She was frequently photographed, often with her children, serving as a reminder that even the highest Nazi officials upheld the values of traditional family life, racial purity, and national pride. Perhaps nowhere was Magda's symbolic power more evident than in her role as a mother. Between 1932 and 1940 she gave birth to 6 children: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. The children, all blonde and photogenic, were presented to the public as the embodiment of the Aryan ideal. Official portraits of the Goebbels family appeared in magazines, newspapers, and propaganda films. The image of Magda, surrounded by her children, smiling gently as they played or stood obediently beside her, was used deliberately to show that Nazi leadership was grounded in traditional family values. She became in effect the regime's unofficial first lady, since Hitler remained unmarried and kept his long-term companion, Eva Braun, out of the public eye. It was Magda's family that the nation saw as the prototype of what every German household should aspire to become. The reality behind the curated image, however, was far more complex and painful. Magda's marriage to Joseph Goebbels was troubled almost from the beginning. Goebbels, while loyal to Hitler and the Nazi vision, was a notorious womanizer. His ego, charisma, and desire for adoration extended well beyond political arenas and into his personal life. His extramarital affairs were not fleeting indiscretions but prolonged and emotionally charged relationships, many of which were difficult for Magda to ignore. His most infamous affair was with Czech actress Lida Barova, a glamorous and successful film star who captured his attention for several years in the mid-1930s. The relationship was not only romantic but highly public, and it eventually caused a serious crisis within the Goebbels marriage and even within the Nazi leadership. Magda was devastated by Goebbels' infidelity. She had given her life to the regime, to Hitler, and to the carefully maintained image of Nazi domestic harmony. The revelation of his affair, particularly its intensity and duration, was a direct threat to both her emotional stability and her public role. She considered divorce, an option that would have shattered the myth of the ideal Nazi family. The situation became so serious that Hitler himself had to intervene. A divorce would have been politically catastrophic. It would have undermined the credibility of one of his closest ministers and threatened the carefully maintained propaganda narrative that Magda had come to embody. Hitler summoned both Magda and Goebbels, personally ordered them to reconcile, and even threatened Goebbels with dismissal if he did not end the affair immediately. Out of loyalty to Hitler and the regime, Magda agreed to stay in the marriage, though the emotional wounds never fully healed. This reveals not just the personal cost Magda paid for her public role but also the degree to which her life was no longer her own. Her emotions, her family, her marriage all were subordinate to the greater image of the empire. She sacrificed personal dignity for the maintenance of the ideological fantasy she had helped create. Even after the affair ended, her relationship with Goebbels remained fraught. He continued to be unfaithful, and she continued to feel trapped in a life that demanded total conformity and public silence. Yet she maintained her composure not only because of her loyalty to Hitler, but also because she had no alternative. Her identity was entirely bound up with the regime, and by extension with her marriage. To walk away from Goebbels would be to walk away from the center of power that had given her life meaning. Despite her personal unhappiness, Magda continued to function as the regime's maternal icon. She participated in charitable events, offered public support for soldiers and war widows, and made appearances meant to lift the national spirit during the darkest days of the war. Her children, well-behaved and photogenic, continued to feature in propaganda as the war progressed. But behind closed doors the reality was deteriorating. The war was taking its toll on Germany, and the cracks in the facade were growing harder to hide. Magda's mental and emotional state also began to erode. Her role demanded emotional repression and unrelenting loyalty, but her private world was increasingly marked by despair, betrayal, and disillusionment. As her marriage deteriorated further and Germany's military situation worsened, Magda grew increasingly fatalistic. She clung to her loyalty to Hitler with almost religious fervor, convinced that his cause was not just politically correct, but morally necessary. This emotional attachment to the Führer, which had been cultivated over years of intimacy and ideological affirmation, became the axis around which all her decisions revolved. She came to believe that there was no life worth living without the empire, without Hitler, without the world they had created. The family she had used as a propaganda symbol was now her last anchor, and even that, in the end, would not be spared. In retrospect, the contradictions that defined Magda's life, devotion and disillusionment, privilege and entrapment, public strength and private suffering, were never fully resolved. Her marriage to Goebbels began as a symbol of Nazi unity and purpose, yet it slowly unraveled into a portrait of emotional decay masked by relentless propaganda. She sacrificed personal happiness and moral autonomy to preserve an image and a role that served the state. And when the state began to collapse, so too did the rationale for her life. Thus, Magda's marriage to Joseph Goebbels was not simply a union between two people, it was an ideological contract, a mutual pact with the Nazi regime that demanded personal subordination in exchange for public glory. In giving herself fully to this role, Magda helped sustain the image of a political order that promised salvation and delivered catastrophe. The final consequence of that devotion would be borne not only by herself but tragically by her children as well. The very family that had symbolized the vitality of the empire would, in the final days of the war, become the ultimate expression of its nihilistic end. The Goebbels household stood as one of the most iconic symbols of Nazi domesticity. Lavish, meticulously maintained and ideologically curated, the villa in Berlin's exclusive Schwanenwerder district served as both a private residence and a stage for public performance. It was more than a home, it was a projection of the empire's values, discipline, aesthetic control, and racial superiority packaged as bourgeois respectability. Every detail was calculated to align with National Socialist ideals, from the architectural minimalism to the children's uniforms, down to the artwork that adorned the walls. This was the home of Joseph Goebbels, the Empire Minister of Propaganda, and his wife Magda, who had become the most visible woman in Hitler's Germany. What the world saw through photographs and media portrayals was a portrait of order, tradition, and national pride, in Aryan Eden in the heart of a crumbling Europe. The Goebbels villa hosted a steady stream of guests, ambassadors, Nazi party leaders, foreign dignitaries, and artists favored by the regime. These visitors were treated to a curated performance of harmony and warmth. Magda's charm played a vital role. She was elegant, fluent in several languages, and possessed a natural poise that made her the perfect Nazi hostess. Her reputation as warm, maternal, and graceful added a layer of humanity to an otherwise terrifying political machine. When visitors arrived, Magda presented the face of a normal, loving, and stable German family, exactly the image the Third Empire wanted to project to the world. She had mastered the dual role of being both a symbol and a facilitator of propaganda. Whether she was arranging flowers before a diplomatic dinner, chatting casually with visiting journalists, or ensuring her children were well-dressed and polite for a family photo shoot, every action reinforced the illusion of an empire built on timeless values. The Goebbels family, fronted by Magda, became the domestic face of Nazi ideology, contrasting Hitler's public celibacy and secret relationship with Eva Braun. Magda's children, always neat and angelic in public appearances, reinforced this carefully crafted illusion of the Nazi dream family. Each photograph of them was a political message. Here was what Germany should aspire to be: pure, obedient, and blessed with maternal love and paternal authority. Yet, behind the velvet curtains and flower arrangements, reality often betrayed the propaganda. Diaries and personal letters suggest that Magda's inner world was far more conflicted than her public demeanor allowed. Although she had willingly taken up her role and initially embraced National Socialist ideals with enthusiasm, over time there is evidence that she became increasingly disillusioned. Her husband's many affairs, particularly the humiliating public affair with Lida Barova, eroded her trust and personal dignity. Even Hitler's personal intervention to save the marriage could not fully repair the damage. While she continued to play her role dutifully, there were moments when the mask slipped. Her letters occasionally hinted at weariness and confusion, even fear. She confided in close friends about her emotional fatigue, the strain of constant public scrutiny, and the emptiness she sometimes felt despite the luxurious trappings of her life. Her diary, though often guarded in tone, revealed flashes of anxiety about the course of the war and subtle acknowledgments that the regime's moral certainty was beginning to unravel. These glimpses into her psyche show a woman who had bound her identity to the success of a regime, only to slowly realize that it was built on increasingly unstable foundations. Still, Magda never publicly wavered. Her commitment to the image she helped create and the ideology she had embraced remained outwardly intact. Nowhere was this more evident than in the way she raised her children. The Goebbels children were not only brought up in material comfort, but they were also raised to be loyal subjects of the empire. Their names, beginning with H in honor of Hitler, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, symbolized this allegiance from birth. Their upbringing was carefully aligned with the values of National Socialism: obedience, discipline, pride in their racial heritage, and unwavering respect for the Führer. They attended Nazi youth organizations, were taught to speak of Hitler with reverence, and were regularly present at political events, sometimes even meeting Hitler himself, who treated them with paternal affection. To Magda, this indoctrination was not brainwashing but a gift. She believed that she was preparing her children for a future in a great German empire. This belief gave her life meaning. The maternal role she played in public was mirrored, with some distortion, in private. She genuinely loved her children, but her love was inseparable from the ideology she had married into. They were not just her children, they were the empire's children, symbols of a future that she would not allow to be betrayed, even as the war turned against Germany. Within the broader social circle of the Nazi elite, Magda occupied a unique position. She had no formal political power, yet her access to Hitler and her symbolic importance gave her considerable influence. Other Nazi wives saw her both as a role model and a rival. Some admired her composure and the elegance with which she carried the immense weight of her role. Others, particularly those whose husbands were less prominent or less favored by Hitler, resented her visibility and what they perceived as her arrogance. Her friendships within this circle were marked by both camaraderie and tension. She was close at various times to women like Emmy Göring, the wife of Hermann Göring, who also enjoyed a high-profile role. But the competitive environment fostered by the Nazi hierarchy often turned these relationships sour. Each woman was vying, in her own way, to be seen as the embodiment of Nazi virtue, and Magda's prominence made her a natural target for jealousy. She also had a complicated relationship with Eva Braun. Though technically Hitler's partner, Eva was kept out of the public spotlight for most of the regime's existence. Magda, in contrast, was seen by many as the de facto First Lady of the Empire. This dynamic created tension. Magda viewed herself as a legitimate representative of the regime, someone who had earned her place through devotion, sacrifice, and service. Eva, in Magda's view, was merely a companion hidden in the shadows, whose relationship with Hitler lacked the political and symbolic gravity Magda believed she herself possessed. For her part, Eva resented Magda's perceived condescension and the way she was excluded from state functions that Magda attended with ease. Magda's sense of superiority among the women of the Third Empire was not entirely unfounded. She was genuinely admired by many, even those outside the Nazi inner circle, for her sophistication and commitment to what she believed was a higher cause. She represented to many the vision of an idealized Germany, strong, cultured, maternal, and orderly. But this admiration often existed alongside an awareness that her world was precariously constructed on illusion and repression. Throughout the war, as Germany's military situation deteriorated, the atmosphere within the Goebbels household grew heavier. The early confidence of victory gave way to anxiety, rationing, and whispered doubts. Magda's disillusionment deepened, but still she did not waver in her commitment. Her public appearances continued, though less frequent. The propaganda machine she had helped sustain was beginning to falter, and the villa, once a symbol of the regime's stability, became an island of denial in an ocean of looming disaster. By 1944, as Allied bombs fell closer to Berlin and the Eastern Front collapsed under the Soviet advance, the Goebbels home turned into a fortress of delusion. The family clung to the old rituals: dinners, music, stories for the children, as if routine alone could ward off the world outside. Yet Magda knew deep down that the end was approaching. Her diaries became darker, and she began speaking of sacrifice in almost spiritual terms. Her children, once symbols of the empire's bright future, now represented its unbearable burden. She had made them part of her ideology, and as the ideology collapsed, she saw no path forward for them. Thus, the Goebbels household, once a vibrant stage for Nazi domestic propaganda, became a mausoleum for dreams that had turned into nightmares. The villa that had dazzled foreign dignitaries and reassured German citizens now held only the ghosts of a failed vision. Magda, trapped between the image she had cultivated and the truth she could no longer ignore, prepared for what she considered the only logical conclusion. Magda Goebbels' role within the propaganda household was never merely ornamental. She was an active participant in shaping and sustaining the illusions of the Third Empire. Her charm, her beauty, her family, all were weaponized in service of a regime built on brutality and myth. Yet, behind the carefully maintained image was a woman torn between her public identity and private despair, someone who believed so deeply in the cause she had adopted that she could not imagine a world beyond it. The home she had curated with such care became a gilded cage, and in the end she chose to destroy everything inside it rather than allow the illusion to fade. Adolf Hitler's relationship with Magda Goebbels was one of deep complexity, involving political calculation, emotional intimacy, and ideological affinity. Within the constellation of women around the Führer, Magda occupied a singular space. While Eva Braun was his private partner, Magda was his public feminine counterpart, the carefully curated embodiment of the regime's ideal woman. She was elegant, cultured, poised, and maternal, all the things the Nazis wished to see reflected in their vision of Aryan womanhood. Yet beyond these surface attributes, there was also an emotional and perhaps even spiritual connection between Magda and Hitler that endured throughout the regime's life and ultimately shaped the final decisions she made. To Hitler, Magda Goebbels was not just the wife of his propaganda minister. She was someone he genuinely admired and trusted. She brought into his inner circle a presence that few others could match, refined enough to host foreign dignitaries and deeply loyal enough to be relied upon without question. Her children affectionately referred to him as Uncle Hitler, a title that revealed not only his personal involvement in their lives but also his place within the family's emotional structure. He visited the Goebbels home frequently, doted on the children, remembered their birthdays, and brought them presents. He was, in many respects, a surrogate patriarchal figure, a blend of godfather and omnipresent authority. Magda encouraged this closeness. She cultivated it with care, seeing in Hitler not only the leader of Germany but a man upon whom the fate of her family and her sense of personal purpose depended. There was a ritualistic reverence in how she interacted with him. She rarely contradicted him, hung on his words, and tailored her language to match his ideological tone. This was not simply performative. Over the years, she appears to have internalized much of what Hitler preached. In her mind, he became not just a political leader but a prophet of national rebirth. Her admiration was not grounded in blind devotion but in a deep emotional and ideological alignment that bordered on the religious. The nature of her relationship with Hitler was also influenced by her position as the wife of Joseph Goebbels. While Goebbels himself was one of Hitler's most trusted lieutenants, their bond was largely transactional and political. Hitler respected Goebbels for his oratory skill and ruthless loyalty, but theirs was not a relationship built on emotional intimacy. With Magda, the connection was different. She occupied a space that allowed for more openness, at least within the constraints of the hyper-controlled Nazi inner circle. Some contemporary observers and later historians have suggested that she may have served as a kind of emotional confidant for Hitler, someone with whom he could share thoughts in a less politicized context. Whether or not this was entirely accurate, Magda certainly perceived herself as uniquely close to him, a woman whose loyalty and presence were deeply valued. In many ways, this perceived proximity to Hitler gave her a unique form of power, one not derived from office or policy but from symbolic capital. She was often seated at his table during important dinners. She participated in gatherings not merely as a wife or a passive observer, but as someone whose presence affirmed the values the regime sought to promote. Hitler's bachelorhood gave Magda an unspoken but powerful advantage. In a government without a first lady, she became, by default, the most visible and influential woman in Nazi Germany. She stood beside Hitler at ceremonial events, offered support to war widows and mothers, and appeared in photographs with children and party leaders alike, always calm, poised, and representative of the regime's family ideals. That semi-official role came with burdens. Magda was always aware that her image was not fully her own. She was playing a part on a stage, and the audience included not only the German public but Hitler himself. Her continued presence at his side meant maintaining the highest standards of loyalty and performance. She could not falter, question, or deviate. Her entire identity had been built on her alignment with Hitler's vision, and over time that identity became inseparable from her person. Her sense of self-worth was increasingly tethered to her usefulness within that system, and particularly to Hitler's approval. Her personal loyalty to him grew stronger as the war progressed. While others in the regime began to feel the strain of military defeats, Magda remained resolutely faithful. She continued to speak of Hitler with reverence, even when the war turned decisively against Germany. Her belief in him became more than political allegiance. It became existential. In private letters and diary entries, there are moments where she speaks of Germany and Hitler in the same breath, as if the survival of one depended entirely on the other. Her worldview allowed no room for a post-Hitler Germany, no scenario in which her children could grow up without the guiding light of National Socialism. This emotional entanglement with Hitler became especially significant in the final months of the war. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, Hitler retreated into the bunker beneath the Empire Chancellery and Magda followed. Along with Joseph and their 6 children, she descended into the symbolic heart of the collapsing regime, the subterranean core of Hitler's dying dream. The decision to bring the entire family into the bunker was not merely logistical, it was ideological. For Magda, staying by Hitler's side in his last hours was not a matter of convenience or coercion, it was a statement of loyalty unto death. Her devotion extended to the most horrifying of acts, the murder of her own children. In the final days of April 1945, as it became clear that Berlin would fall and Hitler's death was imminent, Magda made a decision that shocked even some of those still loyal to the regime. She and Joseph resolved to kill their 6 children before committing suicide themselves. Magda justified this decision in her final writings and conversations by arguing that life after Hitler's fall would be unthinkable for her children. In her mind, she had raised them not just to live, but to live as the heirs of the Nazi world. Without that world, without Hitler, they would be spiritually homeless, culturally adrift, and morally betrayed. She viewed their deaths not as a crime but as a necessary act of mercy. The logic was twisted and cruel, but in Magda's eyes, it was consistent with the life she had chosen and the beliefs she had long upheld. Her love for Hitler had fused with her maternal instincts to create a grim resolution: better to die in the purity of ideological conviction than to live in a world of defeat and shame. On the night of May 1, 1945, with the help of a physician and a protection squadron guard, she sedated her children and administered cyanide capsules to each of them, one by one. The image of Magda, dressed elegantly in the gloom of the bunker, holding her sleeping children as they died, remains one of the most haunting symbols of the Nazi regime's end. Hitler, by this time, was already dead, having committed suicide in his private quarters on April 30. His influence on Magda's fate, however, did not end with his physical departure. The world she had chosen to live in, the identity she had constructed, and the future she had imagined were all predicated on his vision. His death did not liberate her, it erased the only purpose she believed in. She had followed him from the heights of Nazi triumph to the abyss of total collapse, and she could go no further without him. Her suicide, like the deaths of her children, was not simply an escape, it was a final affirmation of her fidelity. The relationship between Magda Goebbels and Adolf Hitler defies easy classification. It was not romantic in the traditional sense, but it was deeply emotional. It was not political in the sense of power exchange, but it was profoundly ideological. Magda viewed Hitler as a savior, a moral compass, and the father of a national destiny. She built her life and the lives of her children on the altar of his vision. And when that vision crumbled, she chose to destroy everything it had touched rather than allow it to be desecrated. In the end, Magda's story is not just one of loyalty, but of annihilation. Her connection to Hitler shaped every major decision of her adult life, from her role in Nazi propaganda to the final, terrible night in the Führerbunker. She had become a vessel for someone else's dream, and when that dream died, so did she and her children. In many ways, she was the most tragic product of the ideology she had served. Not a victim in the traditional sense, but a believer who sacrificed everything, even her humanity, for a man she saw as more than mortal. Her devotion to Hitler was absolute, and in that absoluteness lay both its power and its horror. From the moment Germany marched into Poland in September 1939, Magda Goebbels assumed a new mantle, that of the patriotic mother and steadfast wife, a living symbol of hope for millions. Alongside her husband Joseph, now the Empire Minister of Propaganda, she embraced a role that demanded grace under pressure, unwavering optimism, and an ability to present the regime as stable and strong even as Europe entered its darkest chapter. Their Berlin home and public personas became part of the broader propaganda campaign. Magda carried herself with an air of dignity and placidity at charity events, military parades, and gatherings intended to bolster national morale. Her interactions with wounded soldiers, displaced families, and children of the Hitler Youth were carefully photographed and filmed, each gesture calibrated to reassure a worried populace that the war, though difficult, was just and winnable. Yet beneath the polished exterior of composure lay the growing fault lines of desperation and fear. As the war trundled forward, the facade became harder to maintain. The early months of swift victories created a false sense of invincibility, but by 1942, the tide had turned. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in disaster, and the increasing number of casualties and turning public opinion weighed heavily on the leaders at home. Magda and Joseph found themselves more isolated. Their former circles, once filled with elites and diplomats, now included military officials, rationed and terrified civilians. As the front lines moved closer and the sounds of Allied bombers filled the skies above Berlin, their world contracted inward, each day filled more with tension than triumph. The cruel new normal of the domestic front was punctuated by air raids. Magda, like many Berliners, became acutely aware of the sound of sirens and the sight of falling bombs. She adjusted the household accordingly: blackout curtains, emergency kits, training for servants and children in shelter behavior. The familial sense of normalcy, children's laughter, formal dinners, social visits was fractured by the fear of sudden destruction. She watched her children, once carefree and photogenic, tremble with anxiety when the family retreated into bunkers beneath their home. Helga and Hildegard, her eldest daughters, awakened at night, remembered the shakes of explosions and the need to huddle in a cramped, dank space with their mother's arms around them. The family that once represented strength was struggling to be strong for themselves. Yet even as fear mounted behind their walls, the regime still demanded spectacle. Propaganda appearances became more frequent and more desperate in tone. Magda appeared beside soldiers, toured makeshift hospitals, and presided over events for mothers who had lost sons. These images were broadcast across radio and print, a noble matron comforting the wounded, embodying resilience. Wartime leaflets featured her, praising the role of women like her in defending the homeland's spirit. Joseph's speeches invoked women of the empire, taking up the mantle of national fortitude, often using Magda as the example. She became a walking certification of ideological strength, even while privately wondering how much longer the performance could continue. Inside the family, however, cracks were becoming chasms. Joseph's career was taking a toll. It demanded emotional investment in speeches, quelling dissent and maintaining the illusion of control. Reports suggest he grew increasingly depressed, bitter about setbacks, wary of Hitler's increasingly erratic behavior, and haunted by the growing casualty reports. He began to neglect his family in the relentless pursuit of his propaganda duties. Magda, though outwardly poised, was emotionally drained. She had begun to internalize the chasm between public and private reality. In personal letters, she wrote of headaches, insomnia, and a pervasive sense of loneliness in the middle of the war's roar. Friends and staff noted her mood swings. At dinners, she might laugh graciously, but later retreat to her boudoir with tears. At public events, she could shift from motherly graciousness to brittle detachment in an instant. The constant pressure of representing an ideology weighed on her. She once confided to a close acquaintance that she felt responsible for the children, for the morale, and for the image she had carefully cultivated. With ration coupons replacing abundance, her world had shrunk to the immediate, surviving the next raid, comforting the girls, reassuring the servant staff. Her 6 children, each born with an H in their name, tribute to Hitler, swung between obedience and fear. The youngest, Heidrun and Hedwig, insisted on staying close to their mother. Helga, Hillary, and the boys maintained the party-required stoicism, repeating patriotic slogans even when their faces trembled. As Berlin's situation worsened in 1943 to 1944, so did the family's isolation. Their social circle shrank. Diplomats stopped calling, and no new dignitaries traveled to Berlin due to threat of air raids. Magda increasingly relied on her immediate family and a handful of trusted women, but even those relationships frayed under the weight of scarcity and emotional exhaustion. Dinner was no longer served in the formal dining room with crisp tablecloths and sparkling silver. Instead, it was a family taking nourishment by candlelight and rationed portions. The stark contrast between propaganda posters depicting plenty and the empty kitchen shelves piqued her deeply. Friends inside the party whispered of cracks in the marriage. Joseph was reported to grow irritable, raising his voice in private about failed campaigns and Hitler's shifting orders. Magda, once willing to forgive his indiscretions and infidelities, began to quietly brood. She questioned the personal cost of participation. She was dying inside even while the empire lived or pretended to. Though neither would leave the marriage, the emotional intimacy eroded significantly. By 1944, they had drifted into coexistence. She in her emotional haze, he in his obsession with propaganda and the Führer's image. The bond that had once appeared so strong now resembled a pressure vessel reaching critical strain. Yet, when possible, Magda continued her war work. She joined Red Cross visits, read letters from frontline mothers, wrote newspaper articles under pseudonyms encouraging sacrifice. She spoke about the power of motherhood as the bedrock of national defense. And she tried as best she could to maintain some semblance of domestic life for her children, though she knew the front line would soon be at their door. By late 1944, Allied forces were advancing on Germany from both east and west. The Battle of the Bulge had failed and Berlin was under siege. Operationally, Berlin was being gaslit by quality from within. News networks lied increasingly to keep public morale from collapsing. But the veneer was gone. In private moments, Magda confessed to confidants that the nightmare could not be hidden any longer and that everything she had built, everything she believed, was crumbling. She began to prepare for the worst, not evacuation but containment. Bunkers were reinforced, children received cyanide capsules to avoid nerve gas, a mind-numbing decision rooted in ideological blindness and maternal terror. Magda, once the symbol of optimism, had instead become a woman addicted to the idea of controlled destruction. Keep the image pristine at any cost. She accepted the inevitable fall both of her party and her personal world and awaited the moment she would face it all without illusions. The war years had shaped her into a figure both admired and feared. To German citizens, she remained the solemn embodiment of Aryan motherhood and stoic endurance. To her inner circle, she was a fading star bearing silent dread. To the outside historian, she became an example of how propaganda and reality can collide with devastating inner conflict. Her family had been weaponized and in turn weaponized her. The price finally would be their last. Magda Goebbels' final days unfolded in the brutal, claustrophobic darkness of Hitler's Führerbunker beneath Berlin, a setting as symbolic as it was tragic. As the Red Army closed in and the Nazi regime disintegrated, she retreated into the bowels of the empire, making choices that would define her legacy with chilling finality. In mid-April 1945, with Soviet forces mere blocks away, Magda and her family joined Hitler in the bunker. Rejecting evacuation, she insisted on staying even as friends and staff urged her to flee. She would later assert that leaving would be a betrayal of Hitler, the cause, and her children. Underground, beneath collapsing buildings and denies, she would remain until the very end. Life in the bunker was Spartan and bleak. Small rooms cramped and damp housed Hitler, Goebbels, their children, and close aides. Rations were minimal, the air stifling. The mood was a mix of feverish determination and hollow resignation. Hitler making last directives, Goebbels passing time in fitful moods, aides scurrying for news. They traded broken news from radios about Allied advances and whispered rumors. The soundscape alternated between muffled explosions and oppressive silence. In this subterranean prison, the facade of optimism crumbled fast. Goebbels, always emotionally volatile, fell into bouts of despair after each German collapse. Magda, once poised and ghostly serene, displayed worrying cracks, worsening insomnia, pallid anxiety, and a strange, cold resolve. She helped calm her younger children with lullabies but withdrew from conversation, staring blankly ahead, likely calculating. We know details of her thinking from diary fragments, letters, and survivor testimony, especially from individuals like Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, and Rokas Misch, his telephone operator. Misch remembered her whispering lines like, "The world will not have me." Junge described her in the bunker hall. She walked, always with her children, always in silence, like a specter. These observations suggest a woman transformed by anxiety into a haunting figure, grim, composed, and utterly resolved. As defeat became undeniable, Magda made a fateful plan. She had resolved to kill herself and believed her children would never be safe or honored without Hitler's empire in place. According to Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger and Hitler's valet, the children were first sedated with morphine before being administered cyanide capsules. Magda moved from child to child in the dim corridor, administering poison, the epitome of her ideological conviction and personal desperation. She chose this path not as an act of cruelty, but as an ideological sacrifice, to spare them a world without Nazism, a world of defeat and moral shame. Logistically, the act took place late in the evening of May 1. The children Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, Heidrun were asleep. Magda, with Dr. Stumpfegger observing, went room by room. The physician confirmed each death before closing the door. It took less than an hour. Only then did she return to Joseph's room. There, moments after Hitler's suicide, the couple embraced and took cyanide together, and Goebbels, reportedly, was also shot by an SS guard, as was customary to ensure death. Survivors reacted with stunned horror. Hans Bauer, Hitler's pilot, described discovering Magda's beauty. She looked like an empress, so calm, so pale, and so certain. He remembered the children's bodies with profound sadness. Junge recalled her own tears when she heard the gunshot and Magda's last sigh. Even hardened Nazis were shaken by the sudden, brutal finality of the Goebbels act. Their deaths were among the last in the bunker. By May 2, Soviet troops captured Berlin. Officials later recovered charred remains fitting the physical descriptions of the Goebbels family near the bunker exit. Autopsies confirmed cyanide poisoning and bullet wounds on the adults. These remains were hastily buried, later exhumed and relocated during Soviet administration. Magda's decision to murder her children and die alongside them stands as one of the more horrifying and provocative acts in modern history. It encapsulates her fanaticism, unwavering loyalty, and utter rejection of defeat. She transformed maternal love into execution of ideological purity, blurring the line between devotion and horror. Her final days exposed the deeper psychological fracture. A woman whose identity had become so wrapped in Hitler's vision that its destruction meant both personal and familial annihilation. Lovers of power sometimes choose death when that power dissolves, and Magda's actions illustrate how ideology, love and desperation can combine in a lethal formula. Her death, alongside her children, shocked not only those who remained loyal to Nazism but the world. It was a final drama of the Third Empire, sacrifice taken to its bitter end, where the promise of the Führer was sealed by bloodshed and broken lives. In retrospect, her final choices epitomized the madness that consumed the regime. Mass death in service of a world that no longer existed. Magda Goebbels became the archetype of a fanatic, elegant, composed, utterly devoted and ultimately, monstrously resigned to the annihilation of all she held dear. Her final act remains a grim testament to the perverse moral calculus of totalitarian ideology taken to its brutal limit. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the news of Magda Goebbels' final acts sent a chilling ripple through a world already reeling from the scale of Nazi atrocities. The murder of her 6 children in the depths of the Führerbunker became one of the most haunting and grotesque final chapters of the Third Empire. The images that emerged, photos of the children in their SS uniforms, accounts of their sedation and poisoning, and the orderly, intentional nature of their deaths shocked both Allied forces and civilians. Unlike Adolf Hitler, who had long been the focal point of Nazi fanaticism, Magda Goebbels represented something more unsettling to many. The ordinary, poised, even maternal figure who, through her personal choices, had crossed into monstrous territory. There was something especially horrifying about the idea that a mother, idealized as a symbol of nurture and sacrifice, would instead choose annihilation, an act that struck at the very heart of what many had hoped would differentiate the domestic sphere from the brutality of war. Because she died in the bunker and left no trial, no testimony and no defense, Magda Goebbels escaped legal accountability. Her husband Joseph, too, avoided justice in any courtroom. Instead, their legacy was constructed through fragments, survivor testimony, diaries, captured documents, and the reactions of those who had known them. In contrast, other Nazi leaders faced international scrutiny at the Nuremberg trials. Men like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer were interrogated, analyzed and sentenced. The absence of Magda left a void, one that historians, journalists and cultural commentators filled with interpretations ranging from sympathetic to damning. The world demanded explanations, and much of the early writing attempted to process what her actions meant. Was she simply the tragic wife of a powerful man, swept up in a movement she never fully controlled? Or was she a willing accomplice, deeply embedded in the ideology of Nazism and personally invested in its outcome? Over the decades, the fascination with Magda Goebbels only deepened. She appeared in books, in film, in psychological studies of Nazi Germany. Documentaries dissected her life, showing family films that painted the Goebbels household as oddly normal, even picturesque, which only intensified the horror of their final days. In films like Downfall, the 2004 German production portraying Hitler's final days, Magda is rendered as calm, gentle, and yet terrifyingly devoted, helping dramatize a narrative that has captivated audiences, the allure of evil cloaked in grace. This public fascination, particularly in the post-war decades, has raised deeper cultural and political questions about women's roles in authoritarian regimes. In academic and feminist circles, Magda became a figure through which to explore the question of female complicity in fascism. While Nazi leadership was overwhelmingly male, women like Magda played essential supporting roles. She was not merely a wife or hostess. She was, by some accounts, the de facto First Lady of the Empire. Her polished demeanor and public appearances served to humanize and glamorize a regime that was otherwise characterized by militarism, cruelty, and repression. She gave speeches, wrote for propaganda publications, attended state functions, and most fatefully raised children explicitly presented as the Aryan ideal. She wasn't passively adjacent to Nazism, she was part of its public relations machinery. In this light, Scholars and critics have debated whether Magda Goebbels should be considered a feminist cautionary tale or a textbook villain. On one hand, some argue that she was operating within a limited framework, a patriarchal regime that dictated strict gender roles and upheld male authority. Her identity, ambitions, and beliefs may have been shaped by the constraints and expectations of her time, not necessarily by her own autonomous decisions. On the other hand, others contend that she made conscious, ideological choices. She aligned herself not only with her husband but with Hitler directly. Her final act, the murder of her own children to prevent them from living in a post-Nazi world, was not imposed upon her. It was planned and executed by her own hand. This debate becomes more complicated when considering her personal history. Born into a middle-class family, educated in Catholic schools and finishing institutions, Magda had access to social mobility and eventually extreme privilege. She married into wealth twice, first with industrialist Günther Quandt, then with Joseph Goebbels. In both cases, she navigated elite social structures and demonstrated clear ambition. Her path wasn't determined solely by subservience or submission. It also required a degree of social calculation and ideological conformity. Indeed, the version of herself that emerged during the 1930s, elegant, politically aware, committed to Nazi values, was cultivated and deliberate. Still, the question lingers: was she a fanatic or simply someone who refused to confront the moral cost of her alignment with power? In some retellings, she emerges as a woman crushed by history, a symbol of how ordinary people become accessories to great crimes through fear, love, or inertia. In others, she's held up as a cold, terrifying ideologue whose final act exposes the extreme end of Nazi thought: that death was preferable to defeat, that children should die before seeing a world not ruled by their parents' ideology. The enduring image of Magda Goebbels has thus become emblematic of female complicity in fascism. While men in Nazi Germany orchestrated genocide, warfare, and political terror, women like Magda enabled it in domestic, cultural, and symbolic ways. She raised her children as ideological citizens, endorsed Nazi motherhood as the pinnacle of feminine achievement, and offered her poise and beauty to the empire's propaganda machine. The image of Magda in Nazi iconography, radiant, calm, surrounded by blonde children, helped reframe brutality as order and family love. Her participation in this illusion cannot be separated from the outcomes it supported. This legacy continues to provoke discussion today. New biographies and historical analyses of her life reconsider how deeply personal ambition, romantic entanglement, and ideological conviction intersected in her choices. Museums and Holocaust education programs use her story to illustrate how fascism demands not just generals and ministers, but wives, mothers, neighbors, and everyday believers. In this sense, Magda Goebbels lives on not simply as a villain or victim, but as a complex, disturbing reminder of how easily morality can be subverted in the service of a cause. Eventually, her legacy is a composite of contradictions. She was charming and cruel, elegant and extremist, nurturing and annihilating. She loved her children fiercely and yet murdered them in cold blood. She supported her husband and idolized Hitler but seemed capable of independent belief and emotional clarity. She helped represent the Nazi ideal, and in the end she performed its collapse with devastating finality. The world would remember Magda not just as a name in a footnote, but as the woman who chose ideology over life itself, and in doing so, became one of the most tragic and unsettling symbols of 20th century history. Magda Goebbels' life and legacy remain a disturbing confluence of personal ambition, psychological complexity, and ideological rigidity. After serving as the public face of the Nazi regime's idealized motherhood and marital devotion, her final act, murdering her own children, sent shockwaves far beyond the collapse of the Third Empire. Any understanding of her requires untangling four intertwined threads: whether she was a true believer or merely opportunistic, how her role compared to that of Eva Braun, the broader myth of Nazi womanhood she embodied, her psychological makeup, and the enduring moral burden represented by her children's deaths. Firstly, the question of belief versus opportunism is at the heart of Magda's story. Her early life, marked by social ambition and marriages rooted in status, might suggest opportunism, aligning herself with power wherever it appeared. Yet personal letters, diaries, and accounts suggest a deeper ideological conversion once she entered the Nazi inner circle. In letters from the early 1930s, she praised Hitler's vision, celebrated Nazi ideology, and expressed emotional attachment to Joseph Goebbels. Those closest to the family observed that her loyalty was not merely performative but emotionally true. Still, her opportunistic traits, social climbing, image consciousness, are undeniable. She used her marriages and public role to enter stratospheres of power. The tension between her ideological devotion and social ambition remains unresolved. Perhaps the truth lies in their synthesis. For Magda, the Nazi cause gave her both status and substance. Her image became her belief, and her belief became her identity. Comparing Magda to Eva Braun illuminates how differently women navigated proximity to Hitler. Eva remained largely in the shadows, her relationship private and apolitical, while Magda assumed a role that was public, symbolic, and explicitly ideological. As the wife of the propaganda minister and the woman closest to Hitler in public life, she occupied a de facto First Lady position that Braun never sought or achieved. Magda's contributions were performative and combative. She hosted diplomats, raised children as symbols, and represented the regime's domestic utopia. Eva, by contrast, avoided such burdens. Historians debate whether Magda resented Eva's personal tie to Hitler or simply accepted it as separate from her own political identity. Their differing trajectories underscore the complex ways women's roles were constructed and managed within Nazi power structures. Magda Goebbels embodied the myth of Nazi motherhood, a central pillar in Nazi ideology. The regime idealized women who were fertile, obedient, and doggedly loyal, and Magda excelled at every aspect. Her 6 children, each born with alliterative names beginning with H in honor of Hitler, served as living proof of the Aryan family. Photographed with militaristic precision, she promoted the image of a maternal fortress, a nurturing yet dutiful German mother. She appeared at war benefactor ceremonies, Red Cross events, and national celebrations, always calm and smiling, projecting hope. This strategic deployment of maternal symbolism was powerful propaganda, reinforcing the narrative that Germany's strength stemmed not merely from marching armies but from strong families and devoted mothers, a message especially potent as the war dragged on and casualties rose. Psychologically, Magda presents a concoction of narcissism, dependency, and ideological possessiveness. She craved public recognition, which she received in spades, and thrived on being at the center of Nazi ceremonial life. In private, her dependency on powerful men, her stepfather, her husbands, and especially Hitler, reveals a woman whose identity was porous, drafted into service of causes bigger than herself. Once she committed, she became fanatically devoted. Those who knew her in the bunker described her as cold, composed, and utterly unshakable in her belief, even as Berlin was falling and her husband was consumed with despair. Studies of her diaries and letters paint the portrait of someone who believed herself personally responsible for upholding the ideological project. Symbolic victories and public praise became integral to her sense of worth. When ideology collapsed, her existential insecurity turned inward, focused on protecting not just her identity, but now the legacy of the family she built as a public exemplar. This brings us to the moral legacy of Magda's children. Their deaths represent more than personal tragedy. They symbolize the moral abomination of sacrificing innocent lives in service to ideology. The images of them in SS uniforms inspired both revulsion and fascination. Historical memory preserves their lives as a grotesque footnote to how ideology can override compassion and maternal instinct. The moral calculus that justified their deaths, that death was preferable to living in a ruined, ungodly world, speaks to a depth of fanaticism that still chills the imagination. Their fate forces us to confront how powerful symbols can become instruments of destruction. In the decades since the war, Magda's story has become a parable about female complicity. She was not a passive accomplice. She was a symbol maker turned symbol of catastrophe. Historians and cultural analysts use her as a warning. Fascism does not only recruit soldiers and secret police, it recruits mothers, teachers, socialites, brides. Her beauty, moral intelligence, and public confidence became the scaffold for one of the bloodiest ideologies in history. And because she believed deeply, her actions were all the more dangerous. In artistic representations, from post-war documentaries to films like Downfall, Magda often appears as calm and composed, her elegance a cipher for fanaticism. These portrayals emphasize the contrast between her polished image and her private inscrutability. Is she an emblem of ideological seduction or a portrait of spiritual derangement? Cultural portrayals leave the answer ambiguous but unforgettable. The lessons of Magda Goebbels are manifold. They remind us that ideological evil is not always embodied in obvious villainy or brutality. It can be wrapped in velvet gloves, family dinners, and maternal affection. She lacked formal power but wielded cultural and moral influence. Her devotion to an abstract ideal led to a private atrocity. Her children were her legacy, but their deaths also became her final testament to extremist ideology, a living severed branch. Her story remains distressingly relevant. In today's world, authoritarian and nationalist impulses persist. The co-option of domestic roles and family values remains a potent propaganda tool. Magda Goebbels warns us of the seductive mix of glamour, indoctrination, and personal ambition. Her transformation-privileged young woman to ideological zealot is a toxic arc that invites us to interrogate not only the public realms of power, but also the private emotions that can drive them. In the end, she was both product and agent, a contradiction defined by devotion, ideology, and the moral obliteration of the ties that should have bound her to mercy and humanity. Magda Goebbels' life and death stand as one of the most disturbing and enigmatic symbols of the 20th century. Her story is not only intertwined with the rise and fall of the Nazi regime but is also emblematic of how personal ambition, ideological conviction, and societal privilege can converge to enable atrocity. Through her transformation from a bourgeois Berlin girl into the unofficial First Lady of the Third Empire, Magda offers a lens through which we can examine the lethal seduction of totalitarianism not just on the battlefield or in political offices, but within homes, families, and the intimate choices of individual lives. Her life was shaped by ambition from an early age. Born into a middle-class family, she quickly learned how proximity to power could offer security, admiration, and a sense of purpose. Her marriages, first to the wealthy industrialist Günther Quandt, then to the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, were not only personal unions but strategic alignments. These relationships gave her access to wealth, status, and ultimately history. Yet she was not simply a passenger of these partnerships. Magda carved out her own symbolic role in the Nazi regime. She used her elegance, maternal image, and devotion to Hitler to become a model of the ideal Aryan woman, reinforcing the regime's most destructive myths through domesticity and emotional appeal. That she is remembered so vividly is partly due to the symbolic potency of her final act, the murder of her 6 children in the Berlin Führerbunker as the Nazi world collapsed around her. This act was not only horrifying in its brutality, but also in its ideological clarity. In Magda's eyes, a world without National Socialism, a world where her children might be re-educated by the Allies, was worse than death. Her logic defied maternal instinct, basic humanity, and even self-preservation. She and Joseph Goebbels chose annihilation over accountability. The message was unmistakable. For the true believer, life without the cause had no value. What her life reveals is the terrifying ease with which ideology, when fused with personal charisma and social privilege, can mask itself as virtue. Magda Goebbels was not monstrous in the traditional sense. She was photogenic, articulate, graceful, qualities often mistaken for moral clarity or innocence. But these traits were merely the vessel through which destructive beliefs were softened, normalized, and glamorized. She was not a woman caught in the gears of history, she was an architect of its illusions. Her story serves as a warning against assuming that evil always wears a grotesque mask. Sometimes it smiles gently, speaks softly, and nurtures children in the name of death. Perhaps one of the most urgent lessons Magda Goebbels leaves behind is the necessity of remembering the roles women play in totalitarian systems, not just as victims, but as enablers, actors, and perpetrators. Too often, historical narratives minimize or erase the agency of women in political violence, focusing instead on their suffering or survival. But Magda was neither passive nor coerced. She shaped public perception, championed ideology, and acted decisively in its defense, even at the cost of her own children's lives. Her presence at the core of the Nazi machine challenges any comforting dichotomy between male perpetrators and female victims. The myth of the innocent woman swept along by the tide of her husband's ambitions or history's force is deeply ingrained, but Magda Goebbels undermines it completely. She was not forced to murder her children, she believed in the ideology that justified doing so. This belief, rooted in a toxic fusion of nationalism, elitism, and apocalyptic loyalty, remains one of the most chilling reminders of how gender roles can be weaponized within oppressive systems. Nazi Germany needed women like Magda not just for reproduction, but for reassurance. Her image helped humanize the inhumane, mask violence with virtue, and offer the German people a maternal figure who seemed to embody order, care, and patriotic devotion. As the 20th century recedes into history, the challenge is not simply to remember Magda Goebbels as a footnote to Hitler's dictatorship, but to consider her as a case study in how ideology colonizes the human soul. Her journey from Catholic schoolgirl to accomplice in mass murder illustrates the incremental, often seductive path that leads from ordinary life to historical infamy. It's a journey made possible not just by politics or propaganda, but by personal choices that, when taken together, have the power to alter the moral fabric of entire societies. In this sense, her legacy is not confined to the past. In an era where authoritarianism, populism, and radical ideologies continue to find willing audiences, Magda Goebbels' life remains a stark reminder of how fragile the boundary is between loyalty and fanaticism, between domestic virtue and ideological violence. She reminds us that the domestic sphere is not immune to political extremism and that the myths we tell ourselves about family, motherhood, and national identity can become instruments of destruction when aligned with a brutal cause. Her name is not a cautionary tale of madness, but of belief so intense and unwavering that it rendered her blind to conscience and cruel to those she claimed to love most. That is why her story must be remembered, studied, and told without euphemism. Not to sensationalize her choices but to understand them. Not to excuse them but to prevent their repetition. In the end, Magda Goebbels serves as both a mirror and a warning, of the darkness that can flourish behind elegance, and of the immense danger posed when personal ambition, ideological purity, and moral detachment come together in a single chilling life.